what you have in your mind. And then it almost becomes impossible to gather enough information to change our behavior. And besides, I think sometimes as soon as we think we have something figured out, things change. Would you agree with that? Nowadays, things are moving so fast with technology, it's just hard to keep up. So we have a responsibility to suspend judgment about a lot of things, just so we'll have an opportunity to learn new stuff. In fact, to make my point, I want to put a question up here on the screen. Now, every one of you in this room, you know the answer to this question. You don't even have to think about it. The only thing I'm going to ask you to do is that with all the energy you can muster, I need you to shout out the answer to this question. I mean, I'm talking come up out of your seat kind of energy. I mean, I'm talking make the people down in the casino wonder what it is we're doing up here in the Sonoma room. Now, here's the deal. It's a simple question. It requires a one-word answer, and it does not matter where in the United States or Canada or anywhere else you come from. It does not matter. The answer is exactly the same. You don't even have to stop and think about it. I just need you to shout out the answer. Are you ready? Are you ready? Yes. Here comes the question. What's the color of a yield sign?
Yellow.
Oh, yellow. That is awesome. If only we're correct. Yield signs are red. And they have been since 1972. Because I know what a few of you are thinking right now. Well, they used to be yellow. And they did used to be yellow prior to 1972. So I have to ask myself, how is it that a room full of intelligent adults would shout out the wrong answer? I believe there are two reasons. Number one, there may be some of you in this room who learned to drive prior to 1972. Not going to point to you, know who you are. But that's exactly my point. You learn something, and then you stick it over here in this, I know everything I need to know about that topic file. You file it away. And someone comes along 40 plus years later and asks you a question, and you go pull out old information. We constantly have to be learning and unlearning and relearning new information. Otherwise, we're constantly pulling out old information because that's the way we've always done it. Those things get in the way of progress and of the younger generations wanting to be a part of what we do when we're just continuing to do it because we learned to do it that way 42 years ago. The other reason I think some of you got it wrong is we confuse things. You're driving down the road, see a red light, that tells you need to stop. See a green light, tells you need to go. See a yellow light, tells you need to, you got to speed up. You got to hurry up and get through the light before the dang thing turns red. You see a yellow light, tells you need to slow down. You see yellow caution signs, yellow caution lights. That means it should be slowed down. I don't understand why this thing is red. It's red because in 1972, we changed it to join the international community. Every country around the world had red yield signs, and they wanted us to join so that no matter where you traveled around the world, regardless of the language that was printed on the sign, you would know the color and the shape of the sign, and you would know what to do if you were driving in another country. We were the last country in the world to change that. So here's the deal. Even though I've shared that with you, there's some of you right now looking up there at the screen thinking to yourself, well, they may be red at the Capitol. Apparently he's never been to my state. Because they still yellow where I live. I know, because I've seen them. I know exactly where they are. In fact, if you get in the truck, I'll take you over there right now and show you exactly where that yellow yield sign is. Well, I wanted to show you that, in fact, they're not just in Washington, D.C. They're also down in Florida, Iowa, Illinois, Texas, Minnesota, Kansas, California, Oregon, North Carolina, Louisiana, Arizona, Tennessee, Nebraska, Georgia, and Colorado. And this is just a small sampling of the pictures I've taken as I travel around the country, because everywhere I go, there's always someone sitting there in the office, in the audience, looking at me going, oh, but they're still yellow where I live. And even though I've shown you 15 pictures on this screen and one on the previous screen, there's still some of you right now saying to yourself, I can't wait to get home. I have to go find this out for myself. So here's my question for you. If 15 pictures on this screen and one on the previous screen isn't enough to convince you, how many other yellow yield signs do you have in your life? How many other things have changed? You didn't change along with them, and yet you have volunteers who come to you and try to convince you something is a certain way, and you look at them and go, I have been here long enough to know it's yellow on whatever the issue may be. And a young volunteer says, if you're not even willing to keep your mind open to something that is reality, I don't know if I can be here. We have to keep our minds open, to suspend judgment. And one final thing on this whole yield sign thing, because there's still some of you it's just eating you up. Some of you are going to have to run out there in the break and go, run outside, and look, take a picture of that yellow yield sign and send it to me. Keep in mind, I'm not saying there's never been a yellow yield sign. I had a guy email me once, say, see, there is one. I said, I'm sure there are yellow yield signs out there. They used to be yellow. Of course, they're probably not hanging on a pole. Some of you are thinking, you ain't been where I live. There's some spots out there. I had a guy in Texas, he said, you'll understand, some places out in West Texas, I don't think the people have actually gotten out there to change them since 1972. It's way out in the sticks, out in the middle of nowhere. But for those of you who still need one last little piece of proof, I went to the Manual on Uniform Traffic Control Devices of the Federal Highway Administration, and right here it is, Section 2B.08 yield sign. Standard, the yield sign shall be a downward pointing equilateral triangle with a wide red border and the legend yield in red on a white background. They're red in every state in the United States of America. They're red in Canada. They're red in Mexico. They're red in every country around the world. If you said yellow, if you thought yellow, what I want you to do is to open your mind and ask yourself, have some things changed about how I should lead people? Have some things changed about how I should see generations that very well might allow me to leave this convention, go back to my committee, and make a real difference because I opened my mind that things just might have changed. And maybe my unwillingness to see that those things have changed, or my unwillingness to just do it a different way, very well may be what's keeping me from moving forward with my volunteer force. If you keep your mind open, I promise you, today you will walk out of this room with an idea or two that can make a difference in the way you lead your volunteers. So here's what I want to do. I want to start out by talking about this generational leadership idea. You see, for the first time in history, we have 4 generations that are all having to work together, that we have a responsibility to build a bridge for. First of all, we have this mature generation. We have the baby boomers, the Generation Xers, and the millennials. First time in history we've ever had 4 generations having to try to work together. Remember my magical moment in 1999 when I showed up at the San Antonio Stock Show and Rodeo and I looked around at all of the people I was volunteering with at all 4 of these generations right there. All 4 having to try to find a way to work together. It was not unlike it was at my job because we have all of these people. Now I will tell you this much, it was a little bit different from my job because we actually had a stronger mix of the generations in my work environment, whereas we didn't have that in the rodeo environment. We had a lot more of the mature generation and the baby boomer generation than we did of the younger generation. I'm a part of the Generation X generation, and I don't know that we had maybe a handful of millennials, and those were the kids of some of the mature generation people who just kind of tagged along and helped along wherever they could. So what I want to do is start out by giving you the demographics of each of these. Most people just want to know where they fall. So I want to give you the demographics of how these break down. First of all, we have the mature generation. These folks were born before 1946. They're age 67 and older. Someone you should recognize would be Gladys Knight. It would be Tony Bennett, somebody like that. How many of you in the room fall within the mature generation? Would you raise your hand? Oh, yeah. Okay, look at there. That's probably, what, maybe 10-15% of the room? Okay, outstanding. Next we have the baby boomer generation. These folks were born between 1946 and 1964. They're aged 48 to 66. Someone you should recognize would be David Letterman, it would be Oprah Winfrey, somebody like that. How many of you in the room fall within the baby boomer generation? Would you raise your hand? There are pot smokers out there. In case you were wondering before you got here, now you know where they are. Raise those hands up one more time. Just so wow, look around the room at that. What a significant number of the leadership of the PRCA committees represented in this room right here that fall from the baby boomer generation. I can only imagine the criticism that this generation had to have gotten back in the 60s and early 70s. Their parents looking at them going, you know what you need? A job. That's what you need. Why don't you just go ahead and shave that little beard off you got there and get rid of that little tie-dyed shirt and those little round glasses and that little protest sign. Why don't you just go get a job? That's what you need to do, because you're never going to amount to anything. Your whole generation's not going to amount to anything. Look at y'all protesting and a little round hanging out at Woodstock. Go get a job. That's what you need to do. You're never going to amount to anything. Wow. How wrong they were. This generation has had a bigger impact on the economic stability of our country. It's provided extraordinary leadership across many industries, government, you name it. This generation has really provided a lot to our country and a lot to Rodeo when you look around this room and you realize the significant number from this generation that's helping to run the committees and the organizations throughout the industry. Next we have the Generation X generation. These folks were born between 1965 and 1981. They're aged 31 to 47. Someone you should recognize would be Tiger Woods. It would be Julia Roberts, somebody like that. How many of you in the room fall within the Generation X generation? Would you raise your hand? Okay. Fair number right there, myself included in that number. And then finally, we have the Millennials. They're born between 1982 and 1990. They're aged 22 to 30. Someone you should recognize would be Paris Hilton. It would be Mark Zuckerberg, of course, the founder of Facebook. How many of you in the room fall within the millennial generation? Would you raise your hand? Raise them up high, and everybody look around the room. I would suggest to you that as you look around this room and you realize the small percentage that come from this generation, this would be in part why we're addressing that topic today. Because we have a void in our industry of young volunteers, of young people coming to the table wanting to help. There's several reasons for that, and we'll talk through some of those this morning. But as you can tell, we have a very small percentage of those people sitting in this room right now. Part of our challenge is there's a great deal of criticism for this younger generation. They're lazy, they're unmotivated, they're unfocused, they don't want to work, they don't have a volunteer spirit. I mean, the list just goes on and on and on about why we can't seem to recruit and then retain and engage these younger people. But the reality is we have that as a responsibility. Because those descriptions that I just gave of the millennial generation, there are plenty of them that fit that description. But there are plenty of others like this guy standing next to this Facebook sign right here that changed not just the way we communicate, who to a certain degree changed the world. Because we now have people connecting with other people. We have organizations growing because of the visibility, because of a guy who comes from this generation of lazy, unmotivated people. You see, I use two people on the screen as an example to show both ends of the spectrum, because we have Paris Hilton on one end who, well, we still can't figure out what she's doing. Well, we have Paris Hilton on one side, and we've got Mark Zuckerberg on the other, and we've got a lot of talent in between, if we're just willing to give them a chance. But you have to suspend judgment about what you think about them and open your mind to the possibility that they could actually do something significant. Because here, I'm going to tell you something this might blow some of your minds right now. Are you ready for this? Somewhere in the future, your committee, your entire rodeo is going to be run by these people. It may be years down the road, it may be decades down the road, but at some point, we're all going to die. At some point, they're going to take over. We have a choice. Fight against them, push back against them, or stand up and say, we've got to figure out a way to utilize them. Because in many ways, they want to participate and be a part of the solution as much as we do. And just to kind of give you a brief overview of why we see this world so differently. Because part of our challenge is that we criticize the younger generation so much. And don't get me wrong, I understand that life does not get good until there's a younger generation that you can criticize. Then and only then has life really gotten good. When you can finally turn to a younger generation person and say, well, you have no idea what it was like when I was your age. And you're like, oh my gosh, I just became my dad. Exactly. Now life is good, because now you can criticize that younger generation. But the reality is, we have that conflict because we all grew up in different worlds. I'll give you an example. Introduce you first to Phil. Phil is a baby boomer. He's 62 years old. He was born in 1950. Do you think all the things that happened between 1950 and 2014, all the life experiences that he had growing up in the 50s, which was a great decade, a Leave It to Beaver kind of decade, that was his first introduction to life, and then he went through the tough times and the turmoil of the 60s and the 70s, and then the changes in the 80s that came along with Ronald Reagan completely changing the direction of where we were heading, and then going into the 90s into now. Do you think all those life experiences have given him a right to just show up to the world and say, I expect certain things. I want certain things from my volunteer experience. I want certain things from my employer. I want certain things from the relationships in my life. He didn't choose to be born in 1950, he just was. And that's made him into who he is. And there's nothing in the world wrong with that. But next we have Allison. She's a Generation Xer. She's 42 years old. She was born in 1970. Remember, Phil was born in 1950, so he had the memories of the 50s as his first decade. She, on the other hand, has the 70s as her first memory of life, of kind of her formative, or initially her formative years. I mean, good grief, her first recollection is disco. I mean, my goodness, and how bad can it get? I mean, disco and bell-bottom breeches and all the other stuff that went along with that. Her first government memory is Richard Nixon and what tapes, and the whole Watergate scandal, and she remembered double-digit inflation during the Carter years and the oil embargo. She had a tough first decade compared to Phil. Let me ask you a question. Based on those life experiences, do you think she's going to see her life differently? Of course. Which is going to make her a completely different volunteer than Phil. Phil, when he got out of school, he couldn't find a job in the 1960s. So now he volunteers, or he has a different level of respect for a job. That, man, when you get a job, you show up on time, you do your job, you don't disrespect your elders, you don't disrespect your boss, you go in there and you do a good job. He carried that philosophy and that core value from his corporate world. He carries that into the rodeo world. He carries that into his volunteer role. So when he volunteers, he shows up, he does his job, he shows up on time, he doesn't leave early, he does what he's supposed to do. But then you have Allison from Generation X. When she got out of school in the 1980s, which was a good time, she had 3 job offers. It was a different environment. She could jump from job to job and still feel confident that life was good. She carries that same thing over into the rodeo world and into her volunteer role as well. Is that going to make her a different volunteer than Phil? You betcha. And then finally we have Kyle. He's 27 years old. He was born in 1985. Think about what the 80s were like. Think about what the 90s were like. Think about the experiences that he's had that the other two did not have. Do you think that's going to make him have a different appreciation for his job, which ties again back over into his volunteer role? You bet. So here's my question. How many of you in this room, every time you're having a volunteer leadership challenge, do you adjust for the generations? Or do you just leave everybody the same? Because I will tell you that if you adjust to the generations, it's not even the top 1%. You are in such a sliver of a group that actually gets it. Because most of us just show up and we look at everybody and say, okay, this is the way we do it around here. Now everybody do it, everybody show up, everybody do what you need to do. Then you have the challenge with the younger generation and you bang your head against the wall. Here's why. Because they all experience different things. They're all a product of the time in which they grew up. And they drag that to your volunteer role every single day. So,